From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today with thoughts on the current cattle market trends, Iowa State University's Lee Schulz. He'll look at the still positive outlook for calf backgrounding returns this fall and winter. And Lee looks ahead to this Friday's USDA Cattle on Feed report. Then K-State's Joel DeRouchey will look at how feeding site mud and cold temperatures affect cattle performance. He'll offer advice to you producers on making adjustments in feeding practices and locations to compensate for that added weather stress. And later, Jeff Wickman has this week's 4-H segment. He'll visit with K-State's Deryl Waldren about participating in 2019 4-H International Youth Exchange programs. All this and more right here on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome once again, and we'll now get into the cattle market trends, as we usually do to start off our Monday edition. Joining us now via phone from Iowa State University, livestock economist there, Lee Schulz. Lee, regrettably, we look back on a week just past where basically it was a downward tone across the board, wasn't it?
It was really, you can't look for many positives when we look at the cattle complex. Live cattle futures were down over $1 really across the board if you look at the near term and deferred contract. Feeder cattle contract quite a bit more, down that $3 to $4 range. I think you could argue some of this is due to the increase in corn prices we've seen, especially later on in the week, really had a push through to the feeder cattle complex. I think that could have impacted fed cattle as well. But really, I think the tone is we're just really middling at these prices. You would have expected some seasonal increases here as we're really getting into October now, and really just kind of really at where we're at the last couple of weeks.
On the fed cattle side, this trade just hasn't been able to get any sort of traction upward. It's been languishing in this fairly tight range for a while. Is this unusual?
I think it's a little unusual just when we look at a purely seasonal standpoint that you would expect a seasonal run here as we get into the fourth quarter. But I think what you need to remember here is we're dealing with some market fundamentals that we haven't seen the last couple of years, primarily really an increase in cattle numbers. Mm-hmm. And I think when you lay that over with some of the weather issues that we've had here the last couple of weeks, I think that has caused some impact on the ability to move some cattle around, and that's just added some really negative tone to the market.
And on the feeder side, something of the similar question there. The futures seem to be ultra-sensitive to corn crop conditions and harvest progress and the delays, which have led, as you noted, to increases in corn costs. Is that relationship a little bit more intense than it usually is?
I would say it's intense here in the fourth quarter because this is the time that we're seeing a lot of decisions being made about selling those calves, backgrounding those calves, some stocker opportunities. So we're likely seeing markets a little bit more volatile to that because producers are making some decisions behind the scenes, and that's impacting those markets as well. When you look at the impact of corn prices on feeder cattle prices, there is definitely an impact. I've seen some research that a 1% change in corn price leads to a 0.18% change in feeder cattle prices. To put that in context, if we're looking at feeder cattle prices right now at about 154 for the November contract and corn prices at about 370 for December corn futures, if you've seen a 10% increase in that December corn future, so that would put us over $4, about $4 That would only change feeder cattle prices, all else equal, about $3 or so. So there is an impact. There also is a lot of other factors impacting these markets.
Among those, demand for the product, of course. Boxed beef was down last week, you note.
Yes, boxed beef, we've seen it down for the week. I think, again, you would have really maybe expected a little bit of run on those prices, which would have helped the fed cattle trade as well. When you look at the individual cuts that's driving the boxed beef, really, overall, you're seeing some strength year over year in the rib, the loin. But really what's, I think, holding that cutout back is the primal chuck and then the round. A lot of that's the ground beef. And we're just seeing, I think, a little bit less growth in that area, what's holding that cutout back.
And it's worth acknowledging that we're now entering that time of the year where beef demand does tend to become a tad more sluggish, and that has to do with holiday demand for the competing meats. So one shouldn't be overly surprised by this, right?
No, I don't think so. And really, if you look at the last couple of years, really that build up to holiday business seems to start earlier and earlier every year. I don't want to say that this is a sign that we're going to see waning beef demand here, but I think it is given a sense that maybe it's not as strong as we expected, maybe here over the last month or so. And so that's really something just to keep an eye on. I think when you look at retailers, they are really featuring beef, but also they're featuring a lot of the other red meat and poultry products, because overall we're seeing record supplies of this. So there is a competing meat factor when we look at demand for beef.
And before we leave the beef demand discussion here, the general economy has taken a bit of a hit here on Wall Street anyway, the last few sessions, and may be appearing to lose some steam. And is the cattle market paying attention to that much at all?
I think it's one fundamental when we look at the cattle market is consumer incomes, what they're willing to pay for beef. And you could argue that is impacting the market. But another factor is the unemployment rate, and we're seeing that really at record lows too. So, there's a lot of factors really, and maybe difficult to pinpoint which one is exactly impacting the market. And I think maybe that's why it's left us kind of at this steady state period, is we're just having a lot of factors maybe offsetting each other, and really that's left prices near year-ago levels and really haven't seen much seasonal increase.
Lee, you brought it up a second ago, the backgrounding possibilities for these calves. You put some numbers together on the backgrounding prospects for producers. How does that look?
Well, I think when you look at fall marketing here, really these markets are offering quite a bit of flexibility for cattle producers. We've seen really a rally in feeder cattle futures, even though it's come back a little bit here over the last 2 weeks, still quite a bit higher than late August. So definitely I think they're marketing calves at higher prices than they expected if they looked at the board back in August. Also, when you look at possibility of backgrounding, so maybe if you're looking at a 5-weight steer and taking that steer out 100, 200, 300 pounds, really all those are showing positive break-even backgrounding margins. Now, that's really going to depend on cost of gain, but cost of gain's relatively cheap, and so my calculations show that the value of gain really is maybe $150 to $100 per animal, possibly, when you look at lower cost of gain.
So those are very positive numbers, and it would take quite a hike in feed grain prices to eat away at those potential returns then?
It would, but the thing I'm probably worried about most is decrease in feeder cattle value as we go out, because my assumptions are really looking at feeder cattle futures and our expectations of what those prices will be several months from now. So while the cost of gain, even though we've seen a little bit of increase in corn prices and what that's done to feed costs, I think the real concern is volatility in the feeder cattle market and potentially seeing prices decline. Really, you could argue that, we haven't seen as much seasonal decline in calf prices as we would expect given the larger numbers. We've seen pretty strong demand from feedlots to fill pen space, and so I think that's really helped hold feeder cattle futures maybe a little bit higher than we expected. There's a lot of fundamentals in the market that suggest those prices could be lower. Namely, we're having more auction volume, there's more cattle available, and feeding margins aren't that great right now. And so I think you could see feedlots back off a little bit, and we might see feeder cattle prices wane some.
But for the here and now, if a producer still on the fence as to whether to hold on to those calves and background them or move them in the market channels, that backgrounding still seems to be a favorable option.
It does. Very rarely can you lock in positive backgrounding margins using feeder cattle futures. And this is one year that, I think it suggests that you can. It's going to depend on your cost of gain, but even under, relatively conservative cost of gain, comparing that to the value of gain, I think there is some possibilities there. So again, that's offering some flexibility. You're marketing at calves at higher prices than you expected back in August, or you could take those calves out to heavier weight and put some value on them.
And our last item with you today, Lee, the USDA's monthly cattle on feed report is due out this Friday. Placements are the main issue at hand here, whether or not we'll see those go still higher. What's your thinking as you look ahead to that report?
Well, that's exactly the one that, I think we've seen the least uncertainty over the last couple of months. We look at that cattle on feed report. Pre-report expectations have the widest range on that. I'm in the camp of I think we're going to be above year-ago levels. We've seen very strong auction receipts still above year-ago levels. We've seen imports of feeder cattle continuously be steady. So I'm thinking we're 1% to 2% above year-ago levels when we look at the placements. Marketings are going to be below year-ago levels. I think that's all but certain. The reason is we had one less slaughter day in September 2018 than the previous year, so that's worth about 4% to 5%. So if we had that extra slaughter day, it would be at par from year-ago levels. Collectively, I think that's going to put on feed numbers well above year-ago levels. Why well above year-ago levels, even though placements are only up a little bit, is because, one, we marketed a few less cattle, but really we've been placing lightweight cattle over the last several months, and so those cattle are on feed much longer, and so that's really building up those on-feed inventories.
Lee, your observations always appreciated. Many thanks, and we'll catch up with you again soon.
Thank you.
That from Lee Schulz, livestock economist, Iowa State University, on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back. You are listening to Agriculture Today. Another take now on our recent weather conditions around Kansas, as the wet weather of the past week, coupled with the drop-off in temperatures, has put a strain on cattle, especially in the case we'll discuss today, those that are being fed in areas where mud and cold are both prevalent. Joining us once again is livestock specialist Joel DeRouchey of K-State Research and Extension with some thoughts on managing through these conditions. Joel, there's not any question that the stress that is brought to bear on cattle in these conditions, it is tangible, it is real, and can impede performance.
That is correct, Eric. We obviously like falls for the cattle standpoint, especially as we get into the weaning time of year, to be cool in our fall conditions, but also dry. And in those dry conditions in particular for 2 reasons. One, from the standpoint of the environment, the pen floors, the feedlot areas that these calves are weaned and run in, it certainly is a better sanitation from that standpoint, but also their feed efficiency and just general things that spill from that in terms of health their growth are always improved when we have a dry condition versus when those cattle have to walk through, stand in mud, lay down in mud to get any rest. And particularly as we start to get into these muddy conditions or prolonged rains every week and that dirt floor never dries, it starts to just come deeper and deeper. And as that becomes deeper, we get more mud accumulations on the legs, and then those cattle are trucking around that extra mud. They get less excited to go to the bunk, and at the same time, they're burning more energy for their daily maintenance. And so the mud conditions in the pen is a big inhibitor of our performance, as well as then that can lead to additional stress, which can break down immunity and cause us additional health challenges. The other side is when we have these additional rains, really the other thermal stress that it causes, because when an animal is wet, in particular cattle outside, when we talk about their lower critical temperature, really what that is it's the minimum temperature before the body starts to go under additional stress or nutrient needs. In this case, this time of year, when it's dry and we have a fall coat on these cattle, it's about 45 degrees and lower before that extra maintenance requirement for energy comes in. But when they're wet, it's about 60 degrees. And so just by having those cattle wet, even take away the mud factor on the floor of these feedlots or these backgrounding pens, we start to increase their maintenance needs, which will worsen feed efficiency and then ultimately lead to a lower bottom line.
So those are the effects out there. This has been studied rather thoroughly at multiple sites and multiple situations as to just what is required here, Joel, to help cattle compensate for the adversity from the cold weather, from the wet conditions, the dampness, and then how to manage that as a producer.
Mm-hmm. There has been quite a bit of applied research done, and a lot of this research goes back several decades, but again, it's still very relevant to today because of the conditions and the environments that cattle live in, whether it's decades ago or today, what we deal with. And that's exactly right. I mean, the one thing, too, when we get to some of these colder conditions this fall and winter, as a good example, some information out of the University of Nebraska showed, when it's in the 20s to about 40 degrees and there's mud accumulation in the pens, when even mud gets about dew claw deep, we're going to lose about 7% of the gain of that group of cattle. If we get down to the shin, then it's about another 7%, or we're going to lose 14% of the growth. And we can keep going down to where it even gets hock deep in some of the really adverse conditions and when the cold weather. We're going to give up about 30% of the growth performance, even when we're providing that adequate diet, just because of the stress and the inability of those cattle to be as motivated to get to the bunk. They're just wore out from that mud. So, again, those are things that we know. We know it's a clear issue, and so we want to make sure that we try and avoid some of this mud. Again, when it rains, we can't avoid that, but maybe how we prepare that feedlot or that backgrounding lot becomes important.
In as far as that actual ration adjustment then, Joel, or supplemental feeding, if that be the case, how does a producer go about calculating just how much to provide to the herd because they want to economize at the same time, given the current economics of the day?
That's exactly right. And we have to look at what the goals of the operation are. Again, in these weaned calves this fall, generally all those are under a limit-fed system where they're fed couple times a day. They may have access to free choice hay in some cases, but when the feed's delivered a couple times a day, those cattle are not on full feed or ad libitum feeding. What we can do in those cases to make sure that we are compensating to keep our gains, but also just to supply them with enough energy, is to basically increase the energy content of that diet and still feed the same amount. So we're increasing the amount of corn, distillers, or whatever our primary energy source is, or we simply can use the existing ration and feed them a percentage more based on the potential gain that we're losing. And in cases where we have frequent deep mud, we're really looking at about an extra 30% on an energy basis. So whether we simply feed more of the feed that we're mixing or we provide a higher energy diet would be the two ways to be able to accomplish that goal.
Want to toss out this added consideration. If shelter of some form is available to the herd, that will lessen the stress, will it not, and therefore allow one to be a little more frugal on their supplemental feeding?
That is right. And in fact, when we look at when we refer to shelter, I mean, that can come in the form of depending where those cattle are. In our cow-calf operations, again, a lot of cattle are out on fall grazing, and as we get into the winter as well, where we have protection from natural shelter belts or trees. When we have some of our enclosed facilities, in our backgrounding yards or feedlots, even tree lines, shelter belts. Some producers will use hay stacks to break that north and west winds. And in fact, that does make a big difference. And we know that in ourselves when we go out on a cold day, if the sun is shining and the wind's not blowing, it doesn't feel too bad. The next day, when the wind's blowing and it's cloudy, we can get chilled a lot more. The cattle are the same way. And so just by providing protection of that cold wind and breaking that wind chill certainly does have a major increase. And again, some research out of Iowa State showed that gains would be increased 15% and feed efficiency improved by 11% when cattle are continually provided access to shelter belts or windbreaks to prevent that extra chilling that does occur in those conditions.
So here we are once again, last week and a half or so, this excessive wet weather and the cold temperatures now that are prevalent around Kansas. This may not last long. We may see some warmer and drier days. Does one want to be consistent in their feeding, making these adjustments now, sticking with them, or go back and forth? What's the thought on that?
Yeah, we can do some adjustments. Again, anything that we do on the cattle feeding side, we want to have gradual changes. It's not that we all of a sudden it gets cold and wet and we jump the amount of feed or the amount of energy 30% overnight. That can certainly lead to digestive disorders and other issues that we can cause. So there's generally a change of that ration over a multi-day period, and we can get into that type of adjustment if we want to account for that variation. The one other thing that we can do is once we get into better weather conditions, if those lots are really muddy as they dry up, is get back in there and do some shaping and cleaning. One of the biggest things that we can do as livestock owners and operators is to provide a floor surface that's going to drain adequately when we do get that water accumulation. The problem is when we get as much as we have over the last month or two, those pen conditions just get tromped down, and we can lose some of the natural grade and flow of that water out. And so we need to get back in there with scrapers, front loaders, and we need to be careful we don't start digging, which is often the case when we get too aggressive with front end loaders, cleaning, but providing that appropriate slope and grade to get that water shed out of the pen. And that alone by itself will probably be as important as anything we can do once we start to get drier weather to prevent additional mud and depth of mud issues this winter when we get moisture again.
And one final thing here, as you're looking at your feedstuffs for compensation feeding in these conditions, you want to know what you have as you make these adjustments in that energy level, for instance, right?
Right. Adjusting the energy level does become important. Again, as we talk about providing more feed, or do we change the feed ration itself? Again, as we look at higher concentrates, such as a corn-based increase, again, we have to be very careful making that adjustment over a several-day period. But then again, then we're kind of back to the back and forth too much. And so oftentimes staying on the same diet and simply feeding a little bit more or a percentage more when we do have these cold conditions is generally a very optimal way. Otherwise, from a management standpoint, if you have other employees or other family members helping, constant communication is needed just so we don't have communication errors within the family or within the business, how that group of cattle has been changed or if they're going to be changed back, because that alone can cause digestive problems and cause us more issues than what we're really trying to overcome.
Several things, Joel, for our cattle producers to think about in responding to the recent muddy lots and the cooler temperatures that have brought to bear that aforementioned stress on our cattle. Good to have you here, Joel. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
That from livestock specialist Joel DeRouchey of K-State Research and Extension. And Agriculture Today is back after these moments away on the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans and more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
From the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Moving on now to today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you. These courtesy in part of DTN. The future of the 2015 Waters of the United States, or WOTUS rule, may be decided in a district court in Georgia, as the American Farm Bureau Federation and supporters of the rule have asked a court there to decide on its merits. For the past 3 years, the WOTUS rule has been hung up by dozens of lawsuits and legal procedures across the country. Now a court has been asked to rule on the constitutionality of WOTUS. This summer, the AFBF filed a motion for summary judgment asking that the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Georgia to invalidate the rule, claiming it was unconstitutional and violated the Administrative Procedures Act. The Southern Environmental Law Center filed a motion for summary judgment this past week, arguing in favor of the 2015 rule based on the science used in drafting the rule. A motion for summary judgment asks the court to issue a ruling based on agreed-upon facts in the case. Earlier this summer, the AFBF asked the Georgia court to throw out the rule, arguing that it expands federal authority over waters beyond what the Clean Water Act allows and is unconstitutional. In addition, AFBF argues that the EPA violated the Administrative Procedures Act by not reopening a public comment period after making fundamental changes to the proposed rule, and withheld, says the AFBF, the key scientific report on which the rule rested until after the comment period closed. After the U.S. Supreme Court ruled legal challenges to the rule belong to the district court level, district court cases previously on hold resumed. A national stay on the rule expired when the Supreme Court rendered its decision. The U.S. beef cattle industry welcomed the recent news of an accord between President Trump and Japan's Prime Minister Abe to begin negotiations on a bilateral trade agreement. National Cattlemen's Beef Association Director of International Trade and Market Access Ken Bacchus says that with Japan as the number one export market for the U.S. beef industry, the success of getting this trade deal done and getting it done quickly is very important, in Ken's words, to the health of the beef industry and producers' bottom lines. According to Bacchus, the Japanese market accounts for approximately 25% of our beef export sales, close to $2 billion in the market. Bear in mind, says Bacchus, that's with a 38.5% tariff, which means that opportunity abounds in the market to develop that supply chain and its consumer base even more. Bacchus insists it's a matter that the NCBA will strongly push for the U.S. negotiators to address. As part of the Beef Industry Sustainability Assessment, a nationwide survey of regional beef production practices was conducted in 7 cattle-producing regions across the U.S. These data were used to generate representative operations that were simulated with the Integrated Farm Systems Model by the USDA to determine national environmental impacts of cattle production. That analysis will be the focus of a Great Plains Grazing webinar coming up later this week. This will be presented by Sarah Place of the NCBA. It's a free webinar. Environmental Footprints of Beef Cattle Production in the U.S. is the specific topic, and it is set for this coming Wednesday at noon. And that's October the 17th. Webinar participants will learn the latest on the Beef Checkoff's sustainability research efforts and the result of this comprehensive analysis of beef cattle production's environmental footprint. Place, by the way, is the Senior Director, Sustainable Beef Production Research at the NCBA. Before joining that association, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science at Oklahoma State University. This webinar part of a regular series hosted by Great Plains Grazing. If you'd like to learn more about taking part in that webinar, go to this web address, greatplainsgrazing.org, Great Plains Grazing, all one word, .org. That seminar once more at noon this coming Wednesday, October the 17th. And K-State is gearing up to put on its annual series of income tax institutes for tax preparers and other interested parties. That will be the 70th annual series of this institute. It gets into, of course, up-to-date training on current tax law regulations and updates. There will be significant education on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as well as reviewing recent cases and rulings and key legislation concerning tax policy, and an in-depth review and analysis of number of tax areas coming up in this series. These will take place very soon around the state of Kansas, October 30th, 31st, Garden City, Wednesday, October 31st to Thursday, November the 1st in Colby, November the 1st and 2nd in Hayes, 5th and 6th of November in Topeka, 12th and 13th in Wichita, 13th and 14th Salina, November 19th, 20th, Overland Park, December 12th, 13th in Pittsburgh, and there will be a webinar out of that Pittsburgh session also, December the 12th and the 13th. For more information on K-State's 2018 Income Tax Institutes coming up very soon, go to agmanager.info. Once more, that's agmanager.info. We're around now to time for this week's edition of Tree Tales. Here's K-State Forester, Bob Atkinson. Bob?
Each year, the Kansas Forest Service, the Kansas Forestry Association, the Walnut Council, and the American Tree Farm System come together to recognize some of Kansas's best stewards of our woodlands and our windbreaks. One of the most prestigious awards a Kansas farmer or rancher can receive is a Forest Stewardship Tree Farmer of the Year. The award recognizes people who have demonstrated a long-term commitment to improving the productivity and the health of their woodlands. Award winners must meet the sustainable forestry standards of the American Tree Farm System and be a certified tree farmer. River Farms has been a certified Neosho County tree farm for 29 years. During this time period, they have conducted sustainable timber harvests of over 300,000 board feet, planted over 60 acres of black walnut, pecan, bur oak, sycamore, bald cypress, swamp white oak, and black cherry, and performed forest stand improvement on over 114 acres of their 200-acre tree farm. Ashley Stiffarm, the Kansas Forest Service forester in Chanute, nominated the Camburns for the award. The Kansas Forest Service is pleased to be able to make these recognitions every year to these outstanding individuals and encourage all Kansas landowners, farmers, and ranchers to consider managing their woodlands and their related natural resources. This is Bob Atkinson with the Kansas Forest Service encouraging you to actively manage and protect the woodlands and windbreaks of our state. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Thanks, Bob. Jeff Wickman is in with this week's 4-H segment next on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. Kansas 4-H has a partnership with several countries that provides 4-H members, families, and alumni the opportunity to be involved in international youth exchange programs. Registration for next year's Global Citizenship Exchange programs is currently underway. Northwest Area 4-H Specialist Deryl Waldren says that there are a lot of opportunities for experiencing life in another country.
Yes, it's hard to believe, but summer 2019 will soon be here, and we're beginning to think about all of those opportunities that exist for 4-H members as well as 4-H alumni who want to go on international exchanges for summer of 2019.
What's the goal? What's the mission of this?
The goal of all global citizenship exchange programs is to provide opportunities for young adults or 4-H members, basically from 12 and up, to have an international experience where they live with a host family. It helps them develop a global perspective and then their sense of place in it, where they fit in.
And they actually are doing a lot of hands-on things while they're there.
Right. The premise of all 4-H exchange programs is they live with a host family and they get to experience that country through that family by doing what that family does. Sometimes the families are rural families, but in Japan they're urban families, so they're simply doing and experiencing like other children in that family what that family does for free time, for school, for work. All these things are all wrapped into just a family experience.
Where are the possibilities coming up in 2019?
Okay, the first I'll talk about for 4-H age members, and these are through Kansas 4-H Youth Development collaborates or works with States 4-H International Exchange Programs, and these are programs for 4-H age, and I'll list off the countries that exist for next year. The flagship is the Japanese Exchange, which Kansas began participating with that in 1977, so those 4-H members from 12 to 18 are eligible to go to Japan for 4 weeks, or there's actually an extended period where they can go for 8 weeks and have some 4 weeks of special language training and have 2 host family experiences versus just 1. Another experience would be Costa Rica, going there in midsummer for about 4 weeks, and that's for 15 to 18-year-olds. Next year we'll be going to Finland, and that's also from 15 to 19-year-olds, also going in July. And then we still kind of have a new country, South Korea. 4-H members could go to South Korea, and they need to be between 12 and 18, and again, that's 4 weeks in mid-July to early August. Some of the other programs we have would be for what we call IFE, International 4-H Youth Exchange, and that's for alumni, those 19 and up, and they can go to 1 or 2 countries from 3 to 6 months in Kansas, and that's from 19 to 25 years old. Those are for going out. Then Kansas also will be hosting a lot of exchanges next summer, and there are some opportunities there also that I can talk about a little bit later.
I'm assuming because there are so many things that need to be worked out detail-wise that you have kind of an early deadline for registrations?
Yes, because we need to know who's wanting to go, and then we have some orientations to get them prepared to go to these countries, so they are going to have an idea about what kind of experiences they're going to have. So this year's deadline is November 1st, and there will be interviews in Junction City on November 18th. And there may be a little bit of wiggle room on the deadline of November 1st, but all people must be interviewed, and it's beginning orientation on November 18th in Junction City.
What's all included with the interview?
Well, they will rotate between a couple of groups, and they'll be asked questions and a chance to respond as best they can. And then, for the most part, most people get selected to go or okayed to go. Once in a great while, somebody might be declined because they probably weren't mature enough, but that's very rare. We want it to be a good experience, so if the young person doesn't have the skill set, we would encourage them to come back later and work on some things, but that doesn't happen very often.
I'm thinking if I were in that age group, I might be a little concerned about a possible language barrier because a lot of these languages are not ones that we typically learn in Kansas. How do you get around that?
Well, there's always many ways to communicate, though one of the things we encourage the young person to do is to try to learn as much language as they can, and they tend to have to speak a lot of Japanese or begin to learn Japanese in Japan. Finland, they're going to speak a lot of English. South Korea, they'll speak a lot of English. In Costa Rica, they're going to be learning a lot of Spanish. So it's a good way to learn another language in the immersion process, which means you're living with a family that may or may not speak a lot of English. So you get to learn, and there are many ways to communicate other than speaking through English.
And, of course, the cost is going to be substantial because of the travel involved. How does that work?
Well, each country has a different specific cost, and Costa Rica is probably the cheapest because it's the closest and the airfare is a lot cheaper. But for many of them, it's the airfare that really has a lot of cost to it. Going to Asia as well as Europe, it's gotten really expensive in the summertime. The range is from $2,500 to $5,000 for a 4-week period.
But this is one of those once-in-a-lifetime experiences.
We used to think that, but now the young people today are going to have multiple exchange or international opportunities. So we like to say this may be their first international opportunity, but likely today's young people will have many more in their lifetime if they want them.
I know that you've been involved with this for a long time. What do you hear from the 4-Hers who take part in these opportunities?
Often they say it's a life-changing experience. I'll talk about a young man who went to Japan, probably 8-9 years ago, and his parents later related to me that when he went over, he was sort of self-centered, and when he was gone, he went for 2 months in Japan and had the 2 families and went to the language training, and he came back. The switch had been flipped, and he was a polite young man, and they looked at each other and said, "What happened? We like it." So lots of good things can happen. And it's a growing learning experience, lets young people get a perspective, seeing different things, different experiences, and that can be very positive in getting maturity as a young person.
What other opportunities do we need to know about?
Next summer we'll be having IFFIs come to Kansas, and we'll be looking for 15 to 20 host families, and they host a young person, can be from Asia as well as Europe, and they'll be hosting from 2 to 3 weeks. And then there will be some opportunities next summer for Kansas 4-H host families could host a Costa Rican or a Norwegian coming into the United States, and they might be able to stay with a Kansas host family for 4 weeks. So we not only have the outbound or the going to a country, but we also host a lot of exchanges coming into Kansas, and those opportunities will be gearing up for those next spring. Plus, we're always needing about 27 to 30 families for the Japanese exchange. We host about 27, 28 Japanese every summer for 4 weeks in Kansas, and as I said, that's sort of the flagship program for the 4-H age. Though IFFI, the one for alumni, that began in 1948, so Kansas has been participating with IFFI for 70 years now.
And, of course, all of this information can be found at kansas4-h.org.
Right, and that takes you to the homepage, and under What's Hot, I've got 2 links for hosting as a host family as well as going, so you can easily click there, and it'll take you to the appropriate page on global citizenship.
That's Northwest Area 4-H Specialist Deryl Waldren. Again, more information is available at kansas4h.org. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.